Welcome to my latest multi-part series, A Gamer's Guide to Feminism. I decided to do this series because there's a lot of people in gaming who think they know what feminism is when they've only seen the tiny sliver of it that manifests on the internet. Unfortunately, that facet of feminism is a particularly loud, mean one, focused on call-out culture, public shaming, and some pretty shaky theoretical principles. An academic friend of mine referred to it as essentialist pap. Essentialism in gender studies refers to the idea that men and women are essentially different in a men are from Mars, women are from Venus sort of way. While no one denies that male bodies and female bodies have some pretty big differences, that's not the same as saying women are, say, naturally less interested in video games than men. If we don't want gaming rigidly split along gender lines, we need to keep the essentialism, whether it comes from a radical feminist or an avowed anti-feminist, out of the equation. There's a lot of bad blood online regarding feminism, and some loud, highly flawed voices have made feminism seem like a pretty unwelcoming movement that's hostile to men who don't want to be blamed for every injustice in the world. There's an idea that the developed world no longer needs feminism, or that feminism has lost its way and needs to be replaced by something more interested in real equality. In other words, many people don't take issue with many feminist issues on a case-by-case basis, but they want feminists to drop the feminist tag, so to speak. The reality, like all demands to drop the tag, is that the criticisms of feminism as a whole would just transfer to anything that replaced feminism, whether that term was women's activism, women's liberation, or anything that involves a particular focus on women. So I wanted to do a series on feminism, not to try to convince anyone that it's the greatest thing in the world, but just to inform people of what it is and what it's not. I'm going to focus primarily on the American experience because that's where the bulk of my viewers are, but I will throw in some references to other countries' histories when it's particularly interesting or better explains a concept. Feminism involves a lot of different issues, including the right to control our reproductive health. This includes hormonal treatments for medical issues, as in the case of Sandra Fluke, who had her sexual immorality demeaned by talk radio host Rush Limbaugh because Fluke was advocating for a friend who took birth control pills to treat polycystic ovaries syndrome. Limbaugh twisted Fluke's argument that a Catholic university's refusal to cover her friend's medication, which is sold as birth control, amounted to a medical hardship. Limbaugh turned that into claims that she was expecting to be paid for sex. Rush claimed his comments were made purely in jest and that he really didn't believe that Fluke was a slut or a prostitute. The question remains why an influential radio host would think it was funny to call a woman a slut, especially if he didn't even mean it. It's not necessary to determine that Limbaugh himself is sexist to agree that the thinking behind his comments was sexist. There's no need to drive Limbaugh into exile or vilify him as a person to examine how thoroughly, and apparently unintentionally, dehumanizing his words were. This wasn't something that happened in the 1950s or another unenlightened time. Limbaugh made these comments in 2012. Another example of modern feminism, Malala Yousafzai's work to promote the education of young women, an issue that is not just significant in the Middle East, but also in some impoverished Western communities and some highly traditionalist Orthodox religious populations. Another issue is the high number of unsolved crimes of missing and murdered Aboriginal women here in Canada. In these cases, the need for safe spaces actually involves physical safety, not words. It may already be clear to some of you that these are all complex issues that aren't exclusively influenced by gender. Poverty, race, religion, and many other socioeconomic variables all play a part. So feminism does get wrapped up in other social justice movements, and you'll see, as we get into the history, how that impacted feminism and caused it to form multiple branches. But we need to get the preliminary stuff down first, because when you don't, things get stupid. A functional role of feminism is to work to figure out why things like poverty have the uniquely damaging effects on women that they do, focusing on systems instead of finding people to scapegoat. I know, great in theory, not so great in practice, especially on the internet. Every movement has their eccentrics, whether it be the conservatives and Donald Trump, shame everything leftists, or flat earthers, birthers, and climate change deniers. These radical groups are why just saying equality for all doesn't work. You don't give equal status to a geneticist and a person who thinks the earth is only 6,000 years old in a discussion of science. Now, this focus on women doesn't mean that there aren't issues uniquely affecting men in vulnerable socioeconomic groups as well, but it's important that everyone's issues get unique and equal attention. For some reason, historically, women's groups have felt left out of civil rights discussions unless there's a specific and deliberate focus paid to the issues of the women of a given group. Again, we'll deal with why when we dig in. I just want to make sure that everyone has an idea of the huge, complicated playing field we're dealing with here. To give you a sense of how diverse the branches of feminism are, have a look at this graphic conceived by online culture analyst David Auerbach. Auerbach divides leftist thought into 4 clusters based on a suspicion versus solidarity axis and a structural versus ethical axis. The farther apart 2 positions are on this diagram, the more likely they are to come into conflict with each other. So the left libertarian form of feminism that I practice up here in the liberal cluster doesn't get along too well with the Marxism of the radical cluster, the social constructivism of the theory cluster, or the moral panic and callouts of the moralist cluster. They're just too far away from the position that best describes mine. However, I do much better incorporating intersectionality and, in broad strokes, protest and populism into my thinking because they're much closer to the center of the graph and therefore less counter to my own thinking. But obviously, people aren't this simple. Everyone's beliefs, including my own, are a patchwork of many things. This is just a place to start understanding. Auerbach mentioned to me that he originally conceived of a third axis, but it became too visually messy. And even with just these 2, you get a sense of how much variety there is in ideas within an idea. And that's before you add in good old raw human emotion. Emotion plays into every equation, and decisions made without empathy aren't good decisions. But the hysterics that consume debates about feminism do no one any good either. And that includes the hysterical opponents of feminism who throw out rational thought and replace it with emotional reasoning. There's this idea that women choose to stay silent. Women choose not to have financial independence. That women choose to earn less money and have less power than men. Those that promote these ideas don't have a very good answer regarding why they believe any thinking person would choose to make themselves profoundly vulnerable in this way. The concept makes no inherent sense. The idea seems to be, based on what I've been able to discern, that who wouldn't want to sit at home, raise kids, and be financially provided for by the men in their lives? Basically, this rationale isn't seeing the cage for all the gilding in that cage. Luxury isn't freedom, assuming there's luxury at all. It's called the 1% for a reason. The idea that women are naturally happier in traditional roles is that essentialism I was talking about at the beginning. It also shows a profound ignorance of Betty Friedan's groundbreaking work, The Feminine Mystique. The Feminine Mystique showed that women en masse were profoundly unfulfilled in traditional feminine roles. Then again, there are a lot of self-defined feminists who lack awareness of the feminine mystique as well. Attempts to force women into any social role, be it childcare or a career in science, instead of letting us decide what destiny we want for ourselves, misses the point of freedom, and the rejection of choice in certain wings of modern feminism is denialism regarding Friedan's work. Not all women are miserable being stay-at-home moms. Some women are quite happy that way. Some men would probably be happy that way if society let them have that option without a huge amount of shame. However, true fulfillment is found when women and men are allowed to choose their lifestyle, not be forced into it by rigid social norms. This idea that choice feminism isn't true feminism is rooted in Marxism, and we'll touch more on that when we talk about the second wave. Another hot-button issue in feminism is sex work, strippers, prostitutes, porn stars, and the like. There's a huge amount of disagreement regarding how much choice is really involved in the choice to enter sex work. Can a woman responsibly choose sex work? Is it a defendable moral choice or encouraging a selfish surrendering to urges? Is it good collectively for women in society? Feminists usually agree that these aren't simple issues because there are so many layers to examine. And that examination is feminism. That's all it is. No, really, that's all it is. This doesn't mean that individual feminists can't be horrendously wrong on certain issues. We're all human and we all make mistakes. And it doesn't mean that men can't be feminists. The role of a male feminist is a delicate and complex one, and I'll get to that later. What I want to get across right now is that there are a lot of diverse, contrary, and competing ideas within feminism itself, and no single individual or group speaks for the entire movement. If you want to keep it simple, think of feminism as an adjective. It's a descriptor. So, for instance, I'm a feminist media analyst. Someone else could be a feminist art historian or a feminist human rights advocate or even a feminist troll. They do exist. A feminist approaches the meat on some sort of skeleton. That skeleton determines more precisely what element of feminism that person concerns himself with. There are more types of feminism than there are types of ice cream, and just because you like ice cream doesn't mean you like all kinds of ice cream or that you like them all equally. Trying to reduce a person entirely to feminist is a waste of time. There's no one kind of feminism. That's common sense, right? Well, you'll see in future episodes of this series that common sense where women are concerned has evolved over time. So it's not that simple. Which begs the big question. If you don't consider yourself a feminist, does that make you anti-woman? No, of course not. Not identifying as a feminist doesn't mean you hate women. Identity is something that's complex and for some people very sensitive. Outwardly identifying as an anti-feminist is a clear opposition to feminism, but if you just don't see yourself as a feminist, that doesn't mean you're not concerned about women's issues. Many people ask me about why I don't just say I'm an equalist or an egalitarian. And it's true that I care about many race and sexuality related movements without considering myself a full-blown civil rights activist. I think it's just as important to make clear that I'm not an expert on all things related to inclusion and diversity. And as I said earlier, I don't consider all people equal. I don't believe that fundamentalists of any stripe deserve as much inclusion as moderates because they exist to take away freedoms in accordance with their own ideology. But I still get mixed up regarding the differences between Shia versus Sunni Islam, so I wouldn't dare be arrogant enough to claim that I can speak on all issues of equality with equal knowledge. I feel confident being a part of setting policy regarding women's issues. So I'm a feminist. I don't claim similar expert status on groups of people I agree deserve a chance, but about whom I still have a lot more to learn. It's exceptionally important to be aware of stuff you're not aware of because the world is a big place. And there's a lot that can be learned through dialogue between experts of different types. Some cultures still practice things like corrective rape, which affects both gay men and women, but the perpetrators of these rapes are overwhelmingly male. The reasons why involve an elaborate mix of cultural factors, including the fact that a culture may dictate that it falls on the, quote, normal men of a society to police the actions of aberrant men and women alike. We'll get to why that may be so in our discussion of first wave feminism, but this men as social police thing is an important concept in understanding why things in gaming have gotten so absolutely positively screwy when it comes to women who play video games. Men in gaming are caught in a double bind. Everything is their responsibility and everything is their fault. But while that may suck and suck hard, the underlying assumption to that responsibility is that men are superior to women. Again, we'll get to why that's so in future episodes. But of course, there's more to the vicious, searing, and apparently growing hatred for feminism online, especially regarding discussions of gaming. Online echo chambers are making true dialogue and accurate information very difficult to come by, and that's causing divergence instead of compromise. Feminism was introduced to many gamers through a relatively small group of feminists who have a tendency towards negative messaging in the language of us versus them. Sadly, the us in that scenario has been women, and the them has been gamers and gaming products. This unnatural divide came to a head when Law & Order Special Victims Unit ran a cartoonishly exaggerated episode about the video game community where a woman is assaulted at a gaming event and then another woman is kidnapped and quits the business. It was dumb. The result of this false gamers versus women dichotomy is that gamers feel demonized. Gamers either resent the assumption that we're white, cisgendered, heterosexual, and male, or we resent the assumption that there's anything inherently wrong with being white, cisgendered, heterosexual, and male. In the series to come, we'll get into some of the history and central issues of feminism that you may not know, since feminism has been presented to gamers through relatively few sources who are more interested in close analysis of gaming visuals than providing context for their criticisms of games and gamers. Don't worry though, there won't be any attacks on gamers, any claims that gaming causes sexism, or any other blanket condemnations of the industry. Again, I'm looking to inform, not to chastise. Part 2 of this series will deal with first wave feminism and the issues from the early days of the women's movement, which are still somewhat unresolved today. That'll be up, hopefully next Tuesday, if the research doesn't eat me.